evening, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, wherever you are in the world. Welcome to today's seminar organized by the Center for Translation at Hong Kong Baptist University. Very briefly, I'm Clara Chuan Yu. I'm Assistant Professor in Translation Studies here and a Research Fellow at the Center. Today, we have the great pleasure to have Dr. Ming Curran with us to give us a talk on the platform, on language teaching in the platform age, the discursive construction of language and culture for self-branding. Before I introduce Professor Curran, further, if I was told by our admin colleague that if the sound will be clearer if you put on the headphone, or if it's fine from the computer, that would be good. Dr. Curran got his Bachelor's of Arts in International Studies and East Asian Studies from University of Wisconsin in the US, Master's of Arts in Asian Studies from University of California, Berkeley, and Doctor of Philosophy in Media Studies, yes, from University of Southern California. His current research examines the nexus of digital platforms, which he will share with us today, cosmopolitan striving and language learning and teaching. He employs both quantitative and qualitative methods in research, and he's strongly committed to work that bridges disciplinary boundaries. And he has published, his work has appeared in 29 journals. So he's also very 29 or 30, something like that.
Probably not that many. I don't know. But I'll pretend I did.
So he's also has been very, very prolific in his research. And without further ado, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you very much, Dr. Yu, for the very kind introduction. And hello, everyone, both in person and online. It's really great to be here. I feel very honored to be giving this presentation today. Okay, so I think I'll talk about what we're going to do today. So my main goal today is I'm going to talk about how platformization is basically affecting teaching of languages. Okay, that's the main purpose of the talk. And I guess although the main purpose is really to focus on platformization, I will talk about how language and culture are represented or discursively constructed by both online language tutors and online language tutoring platforms. And to do this, I'm actually going to be drawing on a range of different studies. So I'm not going to be presenting one single study. I'm going to be talking about a bunch of different work that I've been doing over the last 6 years or so. And I should say much of this work has been conducted with collaborators and students. So I have to give a big shout out here to the names that are listed here who've been really instrumental in conducting much of the work that I'm going to talk about today. And a lot of the things I'm going to talk about are touched upon or discussed explicitly in studies that are already published. And then some of that I'm going to talk about is work that's probably undergoing review. And then some of what I talk about will be things that probably will never see the light of day, but are more based on my sort of the research program that I've been conducting over the past several years, which again is about the platformization of language teaching. Okay, so the schedule of events here, I'm going to talk, I think, for about another 45 minutes or so. The schedule of events is that I'm going to start by introducing some key terms. Okay, so platformization and neoliberalism. A lot of these, of course, are terms you're probably familiar with to some degree, but I think it's important to kind of make sure you know how I'm using the terms in the rest of the talk. And then I'm going to give you some examples of how language and culture are discursively constructed in the online teaching context. And then finally, I'm going to conclude at the very end, probably pretty briefly, by making the argument essentially that we are witnessing the rise of what I'm calling platform language teacherpreneurship. And this is something that's discussed in a recent article in TESOL Quarterly, led actually by my doctoral student, Wang Jinyan, Steffi. Okay. And I should say here, I'm going to put the too long didn't read at the bottom here, because I'm going to talk for 45 minutes. So in case you zone out for now, the too long didn't read is essentially that platformization is causing online languages to draw upon basically all aspects of their experiences and their biographies, their identities in their effort to try to attract students in the extremely competitive context of online language teaching. And I think this has some very worrisome implications. I think there's a lot of good things about online language teaching, but there's also some worrisome things as well. So if you now you're on Zoom, if you want to go and make breakfast or whatever, you're not going to mix too much if you come back after 40 minutes, because that's the kind of the core of the argument I'm making. Okay. So what is platformization? Platformization is kind of a hot topic that's discussed in a lot of different disciplines and areas right now. I'm using the term platformization essentially just to call attention or to highlight the fact that now, in today's world, platforms play an increasingly important role in basically every sphere of our lives. Okay, platforms can be conceptualized essentially as intermediaries. Okay, so they're intermediaries that connect different types of users, and most scholars would say that platforms can be kind of traced back, their rise can be traced back to the early 2000s. In particular, the kind of transition of the internet. As the internet went from being primarily static websites, where you visit a website, read some information, to being interactive websites. This is often referred to as the transition from Web 1.0 to Web 2.0. And this is marked by the appearance of things like social networking services, and in general, a more user-generated content-based internet. Okay, so people are making content and are participating on websites rather than just visiting static websites. Today, a lot of the biggest and most prominent companies that we all know of and use every day are platform-based companies. And I say they're platform-based companies because why? Well, they're connecting different categories of users. So an example would be Amazon. Amazon, you have buyers. Many of us may go on Amazon, buy something, or Taobao. And there's also the producers. People, could be individuals selling things. Could be also advertisers that are advertising on platforms. Another one is Netflix. Right, so on Netflix, you have the individual customers who go on there, but Netflix, by and large, especially in its early days, was not producing that much film and television, but instead was hosting the content produced by other parties. So connecting these different producers of media content with the individual consumers. Another example of Instagram. All right, you have advertising on Instagram, you have individual consumers on Instagram, these different parties. And finally, Uber. And Uber is actually one I'm going to return to several times in this talk, because Uber is a representative in a lot of ways, has some similarities to the broad sort of online tutoring platforms that we're talking about later today. And of course, when we think of Uber, Uber is connecting individual customers who are looking to get from point A to point B with individual workers who are employed by the Uber company and deliver rides. Okay. So for thinking about digital platforms, we could say there's a couple key elements that they tend to have in common and that are especially important for the remainder of the discussion today. So I'm going to introduce them here. One of which is collection of user data. And actually, if you've read the one of the assigned readings today by Dr. Yu, who is of course who kindly introduced me, she talks, by the way, about all of this in I think in quite an articulate and cogent way. So you're welcome to read what she's written on the topic, probably in a more articulate way than I have. Okay, so collection of user data, this is something that you see in most of the platforms that exist today. Another is the heavy use of algorithms for a number of different purposes, one of which is connecting users to services they might like. So you could think of this in terms of Netflix. When you log on to Netflix, it's already suggesting things for you to watch. If you log on to Amazon, it's using algorithms to suggest what you should buy. And of course, in the case of Uber, it's using a matching algorithm to ensure that you are paired with a driver in your area. Right? So heavy use of algorithms. Another thing that these platforms tend to have in common is reliance on users to do a lot of the labor. Okay, and I don't just mean only in terms of labor platforms. I will be talking about labor platforms, but even in non-labor platforms tend to rely on users to do a lot of the work, do the heavy lifting. So for example, reviewing, right? If we use Amazon, we buy a product, we are the ones who then end up writing a review, right? Quality assurance in a lot of ways is kind of purview of the individual user. We give ratings to things, right? We give feedback. And this is then finds its way back into the algorithm that makes suggestions. Okay. And again, I'll come back to some of these a little bit later, because things like reviewing and rating, by the way, are particularly important in the context of online language teaching and online tutoring platforms. So I'll come back to this a little bit more later to talk more about it. And then finally, many platforms are quite lean companies, okay? Meaning that they don't employ that many people, okay? A prime example of this is something like Uber. Uber has relatively few employees. It has a lot of people who work for Uber, but they are in fact considered not to be employees, but to be actually independent contractors. And connect to that, a lot of platforms, and in particular online tutoring platforms, which is really the focus of today, a lot of online tutoring platforms operate in legal gray zones. And so many platforms, including Uber and other companies, have found themselves in a lot of legal trouble in various jurisdictions. So for example, in Hong Kong, I don't believe Uber is actually legal. It operates in a very sort of a legal gray zone whereby people are not prosecuted for using Uber, but it's not actually legal. And this is true in many, many countries. And this is true also of many, many platforms. They operate in these sort of these gray zones where it's not entirely illegal, but also the state oftentimes has explicitly called attention to the practices of the platforms engaging in is not something we want other companies to follow. So platformization has facilitated a gig economy. Okay, so I have to explain what a gig economy is. Gig economy refers to essentially those platforms like Uber that are relying on connecting customers and workers for short-term one-off contracts. So in the context of Uber, for example, you as a customer call an Uber, and an Uber driver then comes to pick you up, is paired to you with the platform. They're not working for Uber, they're not an employee of Uber, okay, they're just conducting a short-term contract, okay? And this is increasingly a very common way in which different platforms structure their labor, okay? And I'll talk about this more and more. The gig economy in general has some good things about it. Scholars will point out that it has the potential for improved efficiency, in particular because it can use this sort of crowdsourced data, right? And it can also use algorithms. It has the potential for great efficiency, right? Greater efficiency, perhaps, than some other traditional companies. Unfortunately, at the same time, the economy, as many scholars have pointed out, oftentimes makes money less by the efficiency it offers than actually by simply skirting labor laws, right? There's a lot of laws that in most, especially industrialized countries, that protect workers and try to keep them from being exploited. And most of these are absent in the context of gig economy platforms. This is what Prassel talks about as gig economy companies taking advantage of regulatory arbitrage. Okay, they're essentially taking advantage of the fact that they are not really official companies, but instead intermediaries, right? And they use their role as intermediaries to pay very little money to their workers, and also to avoid having to engage in things like employee compensation, minimum work hours, maximum work hours, and a lot of the other laws that add to the amount of money that traditional companies have to pay. And so many scholars, people like Mark Graham and others, have written about the fact that this might be creating a sort of race to the bottom when you have the gig economy platforms. And this is especially true in the context of platforms that are not place-based. So I'm just giving you the example of Uber, which is a place-based platform, meaning you as a rider and the driver have to be physically co-present in the same place, right? So when you hire, for instance, Uber driver, the Uber driver can't be in a different country, okay? But of course, in the context of online labor platforms, such as online tutoring platforms, which again is the focus of what we're going to talk about today, there's no need for worker and employee to be in the same place. And so you oftentimes see work moving, especially toward the global south or toward places where there are lower costs of living, or where people perhaps don't have many other opportunities to find paid work. And this can really drive down prices. Okay, so where does gig economy and platformization, why is it an issue now? Where and why did it come from? Well, I would tend to think that it's been facilitated, I would argue it's been facilitated by events of the late 2000s, okay? In particular, I mean the end of the first decade of the 21st century, okay? A couple of things I would kind of think would be important to kind of think of as the landmark events, one of which is the global rise of smartphones. So you actually did not have smartphones essentially pre-2010. In fact, you see the iPhone coming out, I think, in 2007 or so. First iPhone, you see Galaxy Samsung, the kind of flagship Samsung telephone coming out in smartphone, coming out, I think, in 2008 or so. So again, there's a very, very few smartphones previous to that time. Now, obviously, for many gig economy platforms, you need a smartphone, right? You think of Uber or something that doesn't work without a smartphone. Connected to that is the simultaneous increase in quality and the decrease in price of the internet. So nowadays, we're used to kind of having good internet that can allow us to, for instance, stream videos on our laptops and things like that. This was really not the case if you remember in the early 2000s, right? It was very choppy. If you wanted to watch, a YouTube video, you would have to sit and wait for 20 minutes while the video loaded, right? So online language tutoring, for example, wasn't really possible in an era when you had expensive or slow internet. So that's been another big boon for gig economy platforms, and especially for online language teaching platforms. And many scholars would also point to kind of broader socio-political changes that have taken place over the last several decades. One of which is in the aftermath of the US housing crisis and the broader global economic sort of slump in 2008. You saw a lot of investment going to tech startups, many of which actually were unable to make money. And a famous example of this is Uber, which has always struggled to actually turn a profit, right? But has benefited from the massive amounts of capital invested in. In terms of people who are working on the platforms, by the way, you also see people driven to work on these platforms in part because there's been a decline in stable jobs in a lot of, especially industrialized countries in the West over the last several decades. And this has led to people needing to work in the gig economy because there simply are fewer other attractive positions for them to work in. Okay, so I just want to show this very, very quickly. This is like a little map of the internet, just to remind us that the internet was not always ubiquitous. And so even relatively recently, we had a minority of the world connected to the internet. So that just shows you again, in that era, when I said 2010, 2020 or so, you can see here, we have actually about more than 3 billion people are actually coming online. So of course, this is another factor that's contributing to platformization. Okay, I've already given you examples of the economy platform. These are just a few more. I don't know if anyone's familiar with Deliveroo. That's one that's like Uber, but for food, pretty common. Airbnb could also be considered a gig economy platform, right? The Airbnb does not own the buildings or things like that, right? Fiverr is one you might be familiar with. If you've read the wonderful chapter by Dr. Yu that was assigned for this week, she talks about some platforms that could be considered maybe gig economy platforms like pros.com, right? Places where you have bidders and sellers, essentially marketplaces for labor. italki here is one that I'm going to talk about a lot because it's an online tutoring platform. Okay. So the final kind of as moving forward here to talk about a few more terms, one of which is the fact that a lot of these, and perhaps you kind of saw this coming if you especially if you work from a more critical paradigm, is you might have thought I would talk about this. It's platformization, but it's also neoliberalism. And platformization reflects the ascendancy of neoliberalism very much. And when I say neoliberalism, I mean two things. I mean, on the one hand, the sort of economic philosophy that celebrates competition and just competition as being very important. And also neoliberalism is something that affects how people experience the world, affects how they relate to themselves and the broader world around them. Neoliberalism encourages us to see ourselves as entrepreneurs of the self and to see participation in the market as something that is both necessary and good for us to do. And crucial to what I'm going to be talking about a little bit later today is neoliberalism is often discussed in kind of purely negative terms, and you identify things like, oh, well, that's very bad because it's neoliberal. But actually, neoliberalism is most often perhaps accompanied by discourses that are very positive. So discourses of flexibility and creativity and empowerment, telling us, oh, we can be our own boss, we can be successful in the market, we can be our best selves. And that's also something you see a lot, by the way, in the branding of online tutoring platforms in general when they recruit participants, right, and they recruit teachers. And also it's something you see as well in the way teachers talk about their participation in online language tutoring. Okay, as a consequence of platformization and neoliberalism, self-branding becomes very, very important, okay? In the context of platformization, again, platformization is the idea of it is to connect, right? You often have individual sellers, right, to individual buyers, right? That's the intermediary role that platforms play. In that context, self-branding becomes very, very important, right? Individuals themselves are responsible for branding. Essentially, when I say self-branding, I think of it as individuals' cultivation of their public image, specifically for some type of gain, some type of financial gain, or perhaps in some cases you'd also expand it to other types of capital gain, cultural capital, things like that. it's sort of, and the way I'm using it today is kind of self-explanatory, because again, I think neoliberal discourse is quite dominant to the extent that we all kind of are familiar with self-branding. We're often told we need to engage in self-branding. Okay, but certainly in the context of digital platforms and as a result of platformization, self-branding becomes really, really important because there's an immense amount of competition for limited amounts of attention, right? If you think of individual content creators on Douyin, right? Or if you think of individual language teachers on a platform for teaching. A lot of this has to do, by the way, has to do with the idea of standing out. So in the context of platformization, when you have, again, these sort of large markets, right? A lot of pressure is on you to stand out. You could think of this in terms of something like Netflix. If you were a film producer, you would want to have an extremely attractive, maybe sort of cover image for your film, because otherwise, if you're on Netflix looking at thousands of films to look at, they're just going to skip you, right? In the context of other platforms, such as say online tutoring platforms, there's often thousands of tutors to choose from. So there's a lot of pressure on individual tutors to engage in self-branding. Same goes for things like Douyin and TikTok. Right? This is also compounded oftentimes by the heavy use of algorithms, right? Which kind of, in many cases, tend to reward those who are able to get some attention and essentially can remove people who are not popular from things, right? So you could think of this as many of the teachers, by the way, I've talked to have told me, they're so scared of getting a low rating, for example, when they're teaching online, because a single low rating can essentially remove them from the pool of suggested teachers that the algorithm is using to match customers and workers. Okay, so I think I've taken kind of a long time here, but hopefully I've laid kind of the context for this study, some of the key ideas, which are, again, talking about the rise of digital platforms, the broader process of platformization of society, which in many ways is linked to and reinforces neoliberalism. And if people want to discuss that maybe afterwards, I think there's a lot of interesting discussions that can be had about the connections between platformization and neoliberalism. And then finally, the idea that self-branding is particularly important in the context of digital platforms and platformization, right? When there's huge amounts of competition and you have these horizontally sort of integrated markets, there's a lot of pressure on individuals or to stand out and brand themselves. Okay, so now the context of the study. What are we studying actually? So broadly speaking, I'm looking at online language teaching, and that's the work I've been doing now for probably the last 6, 7, 8 years maybe. In particular, social media platforms. This is actually more recent, and in particular doing work with my doctoral student, Wang Jinyan, and then online tutoring platforms. And that's been the main focus of much of my work over the last 6, 7 years. In particular, collaborating with people like Zhengmi Chen and Professor Chris Jenks from Utrecht. Okay, so other online tutoring platforms are OTPs. The first thing I want to say that OTPs are a relatively recent phenomenon, and they map on very well with that period I mentioned earlier, about 2010 to 2020, which is kind of the rise of digital platforms. So if you look here, I've made kind of a little timeline that shows you some of the big popular online tutoring platforms, OTPs, and when they emerged. Okay, 2009, when iTalki started doing their tutoring. These are other companies. You don't have to be, you don't need to be familiar with these companies. Maybe you are, maybe you're not. But these are all online tutoring platforms, and these are their logos. It's a very big market, the market for online tutoring platforms. There's hundreds of thousands of people who work as tutors online, and it's worth billions of dollars. And if you notice here, I've added 2 asterisks. The reason is it's very, very hard to make predictions, or not predictions, very hard to make estimations about the size of the market. It's almost impossible. And a lot of people have written about the difficulty of making estimations about these sort of gig economy online markets. Because, for example, you have some people who might sign up to work, but never actually end up being able to work because it's such a crowded market. So they never even end up being able to really participate. You also have people who might sign up, teach one lesson and then quit. And then, of course, you have people who work on lots of different platforms. So if we counted just people who are giving lessons, even if we were able to do that, we'd end up perhaps being overcounted. We have people who are giving lessons on 5, 6, 7, 8 platforms. And by the way, that's a fact. And I've talked to lots of teachers who taught on many, many platforms. I say that its market is worth billions of dollars. That also is kind of a matter of contention, in particular because in 2021, when the Chinese government enacted the double reduction policy, the market it cratered. It still exists, but certainly in terms of valuation, it's worth less now. just because that event resulted in a lot of the big companies in China basically losing most of their value. And they were, as you might imagine, a huge demand for English language learning in China. That was a big part of the market. But I can say it's still worth billions of dollars. It's still a very vibrant industry. So OTPs are essentially open markets, especially the ones that I studied primarily. Those things like Reply, iTalk, and Maybe Talker. These are the ones primarily where I've collected most of my data. These are open markets. And what that means is that it means students go on there to find tutors, and they're in charge of selecting their own tutors. They browse through lots of tutor profiles. Okay. Another hallmark of these open markets is that students can easily switch between tutors. So they don't have to stay, for instance, like a semester, right? So for those of you who are university instructors, when students take our class, if they don't drop within the first 2 weeks, they're stuck with us, right? They have to stay, and both we and them are not very happy about it, but they're stuck with us for the whole semester. That's not the case for all the tutoring platforms. You can sign up on a lesson by lesson basis. So it's very easy to just switch to a new tutor if anything makes you feel, if you feel at all like you want to try something else, you just easily switch. And in this context of these open markets, tutors are most often responsible for creating their own profile. Okay, so they're given some guidance, but they are responsible for the profiles themselves. Okay, and then on these platforms as well, and this is an important point that may come up in our Q&A, is that on a lot of platforms, tutors set their own prices. Okay, this is not true of all OTPs, but on many OTPs, tutors themselves can choose how much money they want to charge with very, very low minimums and very, very high maximums. Okay. Okay, so this is just, again, a little bit of background so you can better understand what it's like to be a teacher or a tutor on an online tutoring platform. As you could imagine, competition is incredibly fierce, okay? This is a global market, so if you're participating in this market, you're competing against teachers all over the world, right? Okay, now we get to go to the more interesting or what perhaps is the more relevant parts of the data for us today. In the context of creating self-crafted profiles, teachers again are responsible for self-branding, right? They're responsible for attracting learners, and as a result of this, they do whatever they can to attract attention and to attract learners. One way to do this is actually by performing and invoking their cultural and linguistic identities. Okay? And I should say here, I treat identity, and perhaps maybe social reality more broadly, as negotiated and reproduced or produced in discourse, right? So I'm treating categories such as culture and identity as something that we do and which we accomplish in discourse, okay? So identity, national culture culture are things that we actually are open to contestation and change. Okay, I think I'm going to move on, and maybe we can have a longer discussion about this later, perhaps, because again, I think this is an interesting question too, and it goes back to maybe some of the ways that you do research on the platform. Because although I do take a quite kind of critical perspective when I talk about these sort of things, and I see that identity is something that's discursively constructed, negotiated, right, open to contestation to some degree, categories. It is true that I also have conducted some quantitative work as well, which relies on sort of a more sort of a less constructivist approach. But anyways, I want to move on because again, I actually have a watch in front of me that Dr. Yu has very kindly placed in front of me to remind me that I need to move forward, I guess. Okay. So I'm going to be talking today again about some of the identities, right, that teachers perform online, i.e., how they construct or perform culture and language. And before I do that, though, I think I need to talk a little bit about the affordances of the platforms. I said I was finished with actually introducing terminology. There's one more kind of term I want to introduce, which is affordances, just if you're not familiar with it. It gets used in different ways in different disciplines. But a central kind of contestation or assertion that I'm making is that how the teachers represent themselves, so how they present them, how they perform their identities, is affected by the affordances of the platform. Okay, and I should say a kind of central argument I'm making is that in general, on the one hand, you have platform affordances, and they have self-branding tactics, and these two interact in terms of how identity is constructed on those platforms. And in general, what ends up happening is that a one-to-one sort of correspondence among nationality, language, and culture is created. Okay, i.e., oftentimes it serves to benefit, for example, people say like American English teachers or British English teachers who are seen as belonging to a nationality, a nation that is the owner of a language, right? And also as people who are seen to embody that culture, oftentimes signaled by ethnicity, okay, as being the ideal teachers of a language. This is related somewhat to native speakers, if you're familiar with that idea. But a bit more about affordances. So when I say affordances, in media studies, we generally use affordances to refer to what technologies allow people to do. Okay, and this is crucial because affordances are not neither good nor bad. And this is crucial because affordances sound very good, I think. So if we think of affordances, it sounds like a positive thing, but it's a very neutral sort of idea. Okay? It's a very neutral idea. It comes from evolutionary psychology, right? And it's intended to be, again, something that merely refers to what a technology or something the natural environment allows to happen. So in terms of affordances, there's also work that asks us, when we're talking about digital technology in particular, to pay attention to the fact that technology doesn't just allow things to happen, but it actually does make some impositions on us. So for example, it can request, it can demand, it can encourage. So an example of this would be Twitter, or X, but I'm not going to call it X. Twitter, it encourages users to interact with each other, right? This is built into the affordances of the platform because it's buttons you can click, such as retweet and things like that. At the same time, it refuses some actions. So it refuses, for example, posts that are longer than a certain time, right? So if you type out it's more than a certain number of characters, you can't actually post it, right? And I should say, by the way, that of course there's lots of workarounds for this, right? So regardless of what the affordances of a particular platform are, whether it's an online language learning platform, whether it's an internet platform, users will find ways to get done what they want to get done. So one example of this is oftentimes if you're a Twitter user, you'll see people will simply take a picture and upload a picture to get around the word limit. And they'll take a picture and they'll have a long sort of post. And they just use this picture, right? So there's ways to get around these, right? But these affordances still structure, again, the way that people use the platforms. So what are some of the crucial affordances of OTPs? One of them is search filters, okay? On most of these OTPs, you can search for teachers, and the search filter play a crucial role in determining what you can and cannot do. Teacher bios, right? You have to make teacher bios on these platforms, right? If you don't have a teacher bio, you can't teach. And the teacher bio is limited to a certain number of words. You can't upload, a 40,000 word teacher bio on these platforms. There's other important affordances, such as teacher evaluation mechanisms, ratings, and reviews. I'm not going to talk about that today. I have an article from a couple of years ago that is focused more on teacher evaluation mechanisms if you're interested in reading that. And then again, matching algorithms. And this one is also very important, but it's very, very difficult to study, as you might imagine, because most platforms do not want to release their talk about their algorithms. And I talked to companies that asked them if they're willing to share this sort of information, and of course they are not. So I'm going to focus today on search filters and teacher bios. And the teacher bios, I'm going to talk about self-branding. In terms of search filters, I'm just going to kind of call attention to the ways in which the platform affordances may contribute to the construction of particular sort of understandings of language and culture and the relationship between them. This is what a search filter looks like on one of the major OTPs. And if you can look here, you can see that at the upper left, you have a language you want to study, and then you have the lesson category, things like whether you're learning to prepare for IELTS, maybe you're learning, or it's a lesson for children, things like this. You also have the lesson time. This is very important, right? Because you want to make sure you can take a lesson for free. You have the language someone speaks. If you're not a very proficient speaker of English, for example, and you're from, say, Korea, you might want a teacher who speaks Korean so they can explain it to you. And then you see one here that's where the teacher is from. This is a very interesting one, right? Because in some ways, it kind of is not something that's explicitly linked necessarily to what we might imagine as being necessary for proficient teaching, or even as something that we would necessarily think is important for someone to care about. Another one I want to look at is over here. This is a different. This is actually, I guess I put the name on that. I wasn't supposed to, but the name here, pre-fly. This is the pre-fly search filter. Now I've changed the language to Korean, and you can see a slightly different search filter. Right? The affordances here are different. On the left, you have the same thing, the language you want to study. Here, though, now you have the price per lesson, which is also very important. You can understand why if you don't have a lot of money, you don't want to see teachers who charge way more than you can afford. And then you have, I think, a really interesting one, which is country of birth. This is a particularly interesting sort of option because, of course, where you're born has nothing to do with your language proficiency, right? Certainly where you're born, maybe where you grew up, but country of birth, right? That has nothing to do with it. So this, I would argue that in a lot of the work that I've conducted with colleagues, we pointed out this, in fact, is contributing to very specific understandings of what language proficiency means and who is qualified to be a teacher, right? So if you're born in China, say, and then you emigrate to the US when you're 2 years old, right? then you're not considered eligible to be a teacher, right, or to be a good teacher. And as you can see, another one down here is native speaker. This is a particularly interesting one. This is an example where the platform encourages you essentially to seek out native speakers of the language. So this is another way in which sort of the platform affordances, or the design of the platform in this case, contributes to how we understand languages. Okay? Here we have this sort of visual representation of the languages. And as you can see here, the languages are represented by these little icons, which are actually tied very closely to particular national images here, right? So if you see here, we have a Chinese here, and you see the Great Wall, right? Interestingly enough, you see Big Ben there, right? Which you can, again, it constructs, perhaps you could think of British teachers perhaps being the legitimate or ideal teachers of English. More interesting perhaps is Spanish, which of course is spoken much more widely outside of Spain than in Spain, right? Many more speakers outside Spain. And yet you see La Sagrada Familia is what represents the Spanish language in this context. Okay, so I want to show you these examples for us to think a little bit more about how the affordances of the platforms contribute maybe to this discursively producing language and culture. But now I want to move on, and I want to look at the teacher bios, okay? And the teacher bios in particular, thinking about how people brand themselves, okay? As well as the affordances. So see here, you can see an example of kind of the affordances, which is the use of a national flag. By embedding the national flag directly into the profile again, you see it creates perhaps a connection between nationality and identity, right? In particular, language teacher identity. You can also see this in the way the teacher describes themselves. Oh, sorry, actually, you see above there, actually, the platform includes the information they are a native speaker. The teacher then themselves reproduces this and also puts emphasis on the fact that they're a native speaker, and I am a native English speaker from America. So this then becomes the self-branding that teachers engage in. Another example is here. Someone says, I am a US citizen. So tying in particular sort of the qualifications to be an instructor of English to the cultural identity or the nationality of the instructor. You can compare and contrast, by the way, an example of an American teacher here with an example of a Filipino teacher here. Right? So if you see the top, it says speaks English, it's a Filipino flag, says speaks English at the upper intermediate level, not the native, not included. And if you notice here, actually the teacher doesn't mention that they're from, obviously, that they're from the United States, but instead says they're from the Philippines, and then follows by mentioning actually their certified teacher qualifications. And again, you can see this with different teachers from different places in the way that you can imagine language and culture are discursively constructed. This is a very random example I just included. I thought it was interesting. This person says, come learn English with a typical Asian kid who got piano lessons. So here, actually, interestingly enough, embracing sort of a stereotype about language and culture. Okay, so I've conducted actually a fair amount of work on the topic of self-branding strategies. And then so the previous work that I've done on this topic has found that in general, native speaker teachers tend to reference their national identities and things linked to their national identities, while non-native speaker teachers are more likely to reference their teaching experience or their qualifications. This is not entirely surprising, I guess, but just to give you a quick example. You can tell me if you think this is by a native speaker or a non-native speaker. This is an example from an article with I published with Chris Jenks. I'm a TEFL and self-certified English teacher. I've got a BA in English language literature, and I've been professionally teaching for over 18 years. This is, by the way, you can. I'm going to give you one from a native speaker and one from a non-native speaker. You can tell me which you think is which. Versus this one. Hello, my name is Derek. I currently live in Colorado in the United States, where I was born, and I speak standard American English. I love talking about languages and cultures, and I can help with standard American English pronunciation, blah, blah, blah. Studying English with me will allow you to be understood by any speaker of American English. I think it's an interesting thing here. This kind of self-branding through continuous reference to the identity of being an American. So as you can imagine, the first one was a non-native, non-native English speaker, the second one was a native. This is the one I just very randomly came across. So I want to include one more example. And I just thought this was very interesting because I've never seen a quantification, so to speak, of where somebody's born. 100% born and raised in Los Angeles, California. So again, the attempt to very much draw and connect identity with language teaching ability. I think it's not entirely surprising that you see this, right? That you see many native English speakers reference their national or their ethnic or cultural identity. Okay? And it's quite common. I should say, one of the reasons not so surprising is that I've done some quantitative work looking at this, and we can say quite certainly that people want native speakers. So native speaker teachers are vastly preferred to certified teachers. So if someone has a choice between a certified English teacher, someone who has qualifications, but they're not a native speaker, versus someone who has no qualifications, but they're a native speaker, in online tutoring platform context, most people will choose the native speaker. And of course, I don't think it probably needs to be said, but in case people perhaps are from different disciplines, I want to make it very clear, there's no evidence to suggest that native speakers are better teachers. Because even for pronunciation, things that perhaps you could imagine, maybe there's something, no, there's very little evidence to suggest that they're better teachers. And in fact, there's lots of reasons to think that people who are non-native speakers are better teachers for perhaps a simple reason they had to learn the language, sort of a formal setting. Okay, but how about for Chinese teachers? So I'm going to talk now about kind of an ongoing research project I have with one of my research assistants, Wen Jing, where we looked at the teacher profiles of 21 Chinese teachers from mainland China who are teaching Chinese, and we also conducted interviews with teachers. Okay, and what we found is that you see something somewhat similar in the context of Chinese teachers, which is that you see Chinese teachers make lots of references to their identities as Chinese, and they draw heavily upon these elements of what we call Chinese culture, or really what we call Chineseness, attempts to kind of link themselves to China and Chineseness. So I'm just going to show you an example. If you imagine what do you think this might look like in terms of a self-branding strategy? This is an interesting. There's a screenshot of the opening image of one tutor's profile, right? Relying on perhaps one of China's best known sort of Chinese elements. Okay, this is another one. Someone who references they're from Xi'ang's home to the terracotta warriors, right? But these self-introductions oftentimes, right, in addition to referencing perhaps people's qualities as an instructor or their personality, they reference things that are linked to their being Chinese. This interesting choice is that a lot of teachers of Chinese, quite a few at least, choose to actually wear qipao in their self-introduction videos, right? And sort of this image of Chineseness that emerges. This is a quote from one of the teachers in the interview. I wanted to create a vibe with Chinese elements. So when I took the photo, I wore a qipao, a white one specifically. And for the background, I used a feature from a photo editing app, which included an ink wash painting of Chinese landscapes with elements like lotus flowers. It's a very typical Chinese style. And in my video, I also wore qipao. So again, this attempt, right, to draw on the elements of Chineseness. Another person mentions that they talk about the landmarks that students might be familiar with. And then another teacher, of course, mentions the notion of traditional Chinese culture that they're trying to convey via their instructionary videos. So again, we can say here that teachers are somewhat similar to the case of the American teachers who are relying on references to their identities. American as being making them legitimate teachers of Chinese. You see China or English. You see Chinese teachers drawing on these elements which we associate with China. And what we see is actually in the case of some multilingual teachers, we actually see teachers self-edit their preferences to something or self-edit their identity, you could argue, in ways that seek to appeal to students. I'm just going to give you an example of a teacher who instructs both Chinese Putonghua and Cantonese. So in Cantonese, this is translation, they introduce themselves by saying, my favorite things to eat are shrimp dumplings, siu mai, steamed egg, congee with preserved egg, and lean meat. I guess congee with preserved egg and lean meat. It's one dish. Right? Very kind of traditional kind of Hong Kong, maybe a Cantonese dishes, right? But then they also introduce themselves in Putonghua. And then they say, my favorite foods are dumplings, buns, wok, steamed buns, and mapo tofu. Right? So it's very interesting, right? The teachers again in their self-branding, actually are sort of expressing like these different images or constructing their identity differently in attempts to kind of appeal to the students. Right? But why do teachers do this? I think I would argue that one clear reason is self-branding, and that's also something that teachers acknowledge themselves. Right? This is part of their attempt to appeal to learners. Part of it also can be the need to stand out as their teachers in these highly competitive contexts of online tutoring platforms. Teachers need to try to stand out from other teachers, right? So one of the teachers who was wearing the qipao says the first step is to catch students' attention. to make it easier for people to see more directly my unique qualities. And in reference to the teacher with the panda, the teacher said, I include the panda to grab attention, to make people take a look, right? This is a very, very important, sort of point that comes up repeatedly when you talk to online tutors. That and also people who are teaching more broadly in the context of platformization. So people also even who are working on, say, other platforms. The need to grab attention, to make people look. And we could think of this, if you're scrolling through a huge number of teachers, right? It's similarly the way we might, for instance, scroll through videos on our phone or on Douyin, or Instagram, right? Something to make people stop and take a look. So to reiterate, my argument here is that in their effort to kind of attract people, teachers actually may reproduce essentialized understandings of language and culture. And part of this is because of the fact, again, they need to attract students. And one way to do it is to rely on sort of existing stereotypes or ideas that learners have about a culture. Even if you don't know much about China, you might know that pandas come from China, right? You might, or for example, if you're learning English, you might think that a teacher who is from Hollywood is going to be a very good English teacher, right? They're from a place associated with the media that you consume, right? And I want to say though, this is also linked not only to people who are talking about kind of their own cultures, by the way, or the ones they've grown up with, but also other people who have learned languages. It's also important for teachers to draw in and gain attention. This might explain why one teacher who teaches from China, who teaches English and Spanish, makes a statement about language and culture by saying, in Latin America, it's polite to stare at a young lady's butt when she walks by, right? So this claim about another culture, right, which is, I think you could probably agree, kind of incendiary, right, or certainly draws attention, right? And this is, again, the idea being that teachers feel the need, or teachers end up making statements about language and culture that might reproduce these sort of stereotypes or ideas. And one reason they do so is because they need to attract viewers, right? And this is also true if you think about, similarly, if you think you're scrolling through Instagram or Douyin, what are the videos that make you stop? It's the ones that are shocking, right? In the same way that virality oftentimes is linked to things that are unusual, right? If you think of virality in terms of videos or in terms of posts and things like that. Okay, so what does this mean? What is the kind of the implications of this? So I would argue that in these sort of algorithmically driven attention economies, teachers face incredible pressure to stand out from the competition. Right? Competition fosters the need for teachers to try to stand out. And this is true both on online tutoring platforms, and it's also true in the context of social media, right? So I think I mentioned earlier with Wang Jinyang, we've done a lot of work looking at teachers on Douyin, and very similar dynamics emerge, right? So the example I gave you a little second ago about someone talking about Latin American cultures, that was a teacher on Douyin, by the way. Another argument is that the competition for views, along with the affordances of the platforms, okay, so the way the platforms are structured, i.e. things like ratings and algorithms, helps to reproduce these or leads teachers to embrace essentialized representations of language and cultures. And even in some places, to actually simply make claims that are incorrect, right? So you see the need, teachers want to attract students, and then they make claims that are big claim, right? To put it another way, perhaps if someone is taking your class, you understand that you have 8 weeks or 9 weeks to win them over before they fill out the evaluations, right? But in the context of online tutoring, you might have a single 50-minute session, and as a result of this, you might be very unlikely, for example, to disagree or push back. And I remember I talked to one tutor who was talking about the conundrum he faced. Because he was a Korean teacher, and he told me, he had students who were coming to him, and they had a lot of preconceptions that were incorrect about Korean culture based on the consumption of Korean dramas. And he said at first he would correct them, but he noticed that when he corrected students, they were less likely to sign up for another lesson. So instead, he said he ended up kind of creating a very sort of, incorrect and essentialized picture of Korean culture for his students, right? Specifically for the purposes of ensuring that they wouldn't quit, right? And trying to get them to keep taking lessons. And you could understand, I think, very easily, this is something that would be very problematic, right? And as I said a little earlier, when you have a huge amount of competition for a limited amount of attention, that also, again, places pressure on the teachers to try not to get algorithmically sort of removed from the stream of content. And this can happen relatively easily, right? So for example, you get a low rating or you're not going to be watching you, it's a self-reinforcing kind of cycle, right? You're going to be removed from competition. As a result of the pressures that teachers face, increasingly, online language teachers really are entertainers. Okay? I think we all, if we work as teachers, we say we're all entertainers, right? We're all entertainers. But I would say that the pressures that the online language tutors face, online language, is even higher, especially because this notion of the algorithmic attention, right? By entertaining students and by drawing learners in, right, you can increase your chance of getting more students. And this is something, by the way, that is not just something I'm kind of studying, but it's talked about quite a bit by some of my colleagues here, like Aslan and Ho. And I would say again, this is not just language teaching. This is true of platformization in general. Platformization, right, which places an emphasis on heavy use of algorithms and lots of content creators, right, is leading people to have to embrace these sort of incendiary or very dynamic representation that are oftentimes not what we as probably educators and scholars would like. So in the context of platformization, Steffi and I have argued that probably we should not be talking about language teachers necessarily, but actually talk about platform language teacherpreneurs. This is kind of the term we're using for now. And why we say platform language teacherpreneurs is that these people are not just teachers, but they're also entrepreneurs, right? In the neoliberal context, they're sort of entrepreneurs of the self in terms of how they're responsible for self-branding, right? And that these are also people who are oftentimes putting less effort, perhaps, into their pedagogy or into their language teaching than they are into the entertainment aspects. I haven't shown the data because in some ways it's, I think people just laugh because it's very funny. But Steffi, in her dissertation, has some great videos that she shared with me, looking at some of the teachers on Douyin who really create hilarious content, right? Really stuff that's really high production value, and really you can feel these are people who are entertainers first and language instructors second. So I think there probably needs to be a lot more research that examines how platformization, in particular things like the short time horizon that people have, right? The limited amounts of attention, and how this contributes to transforming or affecting language teaching and what it means to be a language teacher. Because a lot of people around the world right now are learning language, and it's not from people who are pedagogically trained, to be teachers, okay? But instead are people who are essentially dynamic entrepreneurs who have chosen to go into language teaching. Okay, so just to kind of conclude here as we come to the end of this and take stock, what has platformization done? Well, for tutors, it's led them to face incredible pressure to self-brand and to try to keep their students happy. It's also, a lot of teachers, unfortunately, face precarity, and they also face very unfair policies on online tutoring platforms. At the same time, platformization has also resulted in tutors having increased opportunities to basically make a living, right? So I've done a lot of work with Joy Panaligan, where we've interviewed tutors in the Philippines who say that even though they do have some very bad experiences, and even though they feel incredible amount of pressure, they're very happy that they have this job which allows them to make more money than they would in the other sort of work that's available to them locally. Okay, so that's for tutors. What about for students? Well, for students, they have access to very cheap language learning opportunities. And I think we could agree this can be a very good thing. We want more people, right, to learn languages. And certainly, if we look at the context of people who don't have enough money to pay for a lesson at a science course at a university, or perhaps people are in a geographic location and they are too far to go to a university, it's going to be a really good opportunity. Right? And I have also found from some of the work I've conducted with interviewing the learners, I have an article on this in language intercultural communication. A lot of people really do have very good experiences, and they are actually able to kind of have very deep conversations and really make connections and develop interculturality by interacting with the teachers, okay? That being said, though, they can also end up confirming stereotypes, especially if people go into learning with certain stereotypes. It's very easy to have those stereotypes confirmed, in part because teachers feel pressure not to contradict students, right? And also in their self-branding, for example, teachers oftentimes might feel the need, right, to basically appeal to kind of the lowest common denominator, what they think students expect. So what about us as teachers or researchers? What can we do? I think this is a really, really difficult question. It's one that I've been asking myself a lot lately. I think we can educate in terms of our students, because I think this is, again, not just limited to online tutoring platforms. This is limited. This is also extends to the effects of platformization more broadly, especially in terms of content creation. You know, all of our students are using social media, and when they come across foreign languages and cultures on social media, they're often coming across them as being represented in stereotypical ways, right? Often for the purpose of humor, or sometimes even the purpose of fanning the flames of actual, things like nationalism or xenophobia. So I think it's important that as educators, we make students aware of this. We can work with platforms. I've worked previously with a platform, italki. I don't know. I've talked to them and shared my findings. I don't know how much they've taken those findings on board. They've listened. And then finally, I think we can draw attention to some of the unfair labor practices. Many online tutoring platforms, by the way, engage in practices that would be certainly illegal if they were based in basically any country. The national labor laws would not allow it. These are things, for example, like docking teachers' pay unfairly, basically wage theft, allowing teachers essentially to be subjected to sexual harassment by students and things like this. So I think it's very important we draw attention and highlight it because I don't see it discussed particularly a lot in certainly the field of applied linguistics. I should say there's a lot of great work being done on this topic, not just by Steffi, although she's doing fantastic work, but also Sandra Kaltenegger, who's doing great work on this topic in Hong Kong, as are my colleagues Jennifer Ho and Sandra Hanbar. So the other people are working on this. Okay, I see now that it's 8:01, so I'll try to wrap up. So I'll wrap up by engaging in some self-branding, because we know self-branding is very important. Right? So you can find me on Twitter and Blue Sky. I'm always looking for collaborators, always looking or friends. So feel free to send me an email, talk to me. I should say this research was supported by the Hong Kong government, so thank you. And also thanks very much to Dr. Chuan Yu, Clara, for moderating this session, and Esther Kwok for communicating with me at great length and helping make sure I got here today. And finally to Rebecca for helping out with the tech today. So thank you very, very much. And yeah, thanks so much.
Thank you very much for a wonderful and very, very insightful talk, Ming. Especially that when I was talking to your talk, there is so much, a lot of analogies that can be drawn between online platform teaching and online translation, the crowdsourcing translation, for example, pros.com that you mentioned. But let's take questions from the floor, both in the room and also audience from online. We will do in turn if there are a lot. So for colleagues and researchers online, joining us online, feel free to type in your question in the chat box. But if you prefer to unmute and raise the question verbally, please raise your hand and we will give the mic to you. First of all, Maddie, we have a question from Maddie, who is a colleague from our Academy at Baptist. So thank you, Dr. Curran, for this wonderful talk. I guess all teachers are cultural ambassadors when we teach language classes. I have two questions. How does deepfake tech affect this business? Will these teachers one day be replaced by AI tutors?
Okay, those are two fantastic questions, and thank you very much. In terms of deepfake tech, I'm wondering what that would look like in the context of online language tutoring. I'm not quite sure, so maybe if you could clarify that. In terms of the AI tutors, I think that's a big concern in the industry, and I think a lot of platforms and companies are probably trying, or I know are trying, right, to use AI. I do think that AI will not be able to sort of decimate this industry that quickly, in part because I think one of the big reasons people use online tutoring platforms is because they want sort of a human connection and they want a sort of dynamic experience. So for a lot of learners, I don't think it's actually even about the language learning itself, but it's also about having connection. I remember I did this big survey with about 1,000 people once on these platforms. I found that a lot of them are looking for a friend, actually. They want someone who's like a friend. And I don't think the AI necessarily is there yet. If people are just looking for sort of answers to language learning questions, I think then certainly AI will probably be able to step in that role relatively quickly. But I think many people will be wary or will not want to have an AI tutor because they want to have that human experience, the human connection they get from the teacher.
Yeah, thanks. Chris, yes, please.
Thank you. Thanks, Ming, for that great, inspiring, wonderful, and cutting-edge talk. I have a lot of questions. I'll limit it to one at the moment. You talk about these self-branding strategies, and of course, the lessons are primarily based on speaking and perhaps even pronunciation. To what extent do you think the self-branding strategies will differ if the focus of the lessons change to, say, academic writing? Do you, in other words, imagine that if the lessons were based on academic writing, that the self-branding strategies would be different?
That's a great question. It's a great first question, Chris. Yes, I think the short answer is yes. I would also say that as you move toward more sort of formal learning, you also see a decrease in people's preferences for native speakers. So the experiments that we did, we found that when people were learning for jobs or tests, i.e. they're preparing for IELTS, they had a job interview, those people were less likely to prefer native speakers, i.e. their preference for native speakers went down. While the people who were learning, say, for reasons related more toward things like interest in the culture, then you saw preference for native speaker teachers go up. So I think the self-branding strategy does differ as well, because I think online language tutors tend to be very good at self-branding. I think they tend to understand what their strengths and weaknesses are.
So have you found any differences between Chinese teachers and English teachers in forming their identities?
That's an excellent question. That's one thing I'm really working on right now to find out what are the differences in self-branding strategies. So I'm working with some student RAs right now, and we're actually doing a quantitative work looking at several hundred tutors and trying to understand what are the differences in the self-branding strategies of English
For
versus
some, we
Chinese.
see those American teachers wearing American costumes, right?
Oh, yeah.
From a Hollywood movies, Superman, but Chinese people wear qigong.
Although I have seen tutors in the past who do kind of make reference to their American identities, but certainly I haven't seen any tutors wearing cowboy hats. I think I've seen one tutor wearing a cowboy hat actually. But that's not certainly not the cheap out.
Yeah, the cheaper and the panda.
And also the Chinese teacher mentioned a lot of food.
Oh, yes,
But
yes.
American teachers will never mention the food because they assume everyone knows hamburgers or there's nothing special for American food. Honestly.
I've seen American teachers talk about local foods and things
They talk about local food in their bio.
in their self-introduction video.
Oh, in their videos.
Interaction between identity and food. As you also usually
Yeah, it's
discuss
very
in English that like anthropologists.
Yeah. Actually, I have a colleague, Jennifer Ho, who's actually doing some very interesting work looking at like vloggers and looking at food, how food is discussed, and the role it plays right in terms of identity and culture.
I see that Chris has something to chip in.
I just had another question, if I may. Your talk sort of straddles the border of critical studies, and you talk and seem to be somewhat critical of some of the self-branding strategies and some of the platforms' reliance on things like country of birth and native speaker. Do you think that these platforms have a responsibility to police the ways in which customers filter information?
Yes, I think they do. And I actually think that I think the platforms increasingly are aware of that, because I've noticed some platforms will change. Okay, so I remember when I first started working with italki, they had native speaker and they had gender. And I believe those are no longer the case. I have to be careful whenever I say something because things do change around these platforms over time. But I think they've gotten rid of both gender and the filter for gender as well as the filter for native speaker. And I think that's good. I think that's a good thing. I think that in general, I think it's the platform to bear some responsibility to try to make a more equitable and fair playing field essentially for tutors. Especially because I think a lot of students, they come in with the assumption that native speaker teachers are better. They come in with this assumption, and I think the platforms could very easily dissuade them on that. In fact, even though I've said that this kind of reinforces, I think, the preferences maybe for native speakers, I will say that the fact that you only take a single lesson and you can switch between teachers, that actually caused a lot of learners to take a lesson from someone who's not a native speaker because it's such a low barrier. So I've talked to students who said, oh, I took a lesson, say, I wanted to take a lesson from American, but then I took a lesson from a Filipino teacher because I wanted to see what it was like. It was so cheap. And I realized, wow, they were actually like a much better teacher. They were like actually teaching me. It was a great experience. And then because of that, they were able to kind of unlearn this assumption that Americans, or Brits would be ideal teachers. Does that answer the question though, Chris?
Yeah, thank you.
There's a question, a really interesting question here from Lam. From your research, is there a stronger pressure for female tutors to self-brand more to their physical appearance? That's a really, really good question. That's a really, really good question. I would say, I think all teachers sort of feel pressure to try to improve their appearance. And this is something I've seen from the teachers I've talked to. They feel appearance is an important part of attracting students. But I think this probably mirrors somewhat the degree to what you see in the offline context as well. I should say one chapter of Stephanie's dissertation, I think, explicitly discusses this and discusses gender and the pressure and women respond to this pressure. I should say it's a feminized industry as well. There's work on that. This interesting article that we published last year on that topic. It's overwhelmingly females who are teaching globally. And I should say, when I conducted like an anonymous survey, I also found a lot of students would mention that they wanted an attractive teacher. Interestingly enough, so, and that was both men and women who mentioned this.
I'm wondering, like, what are the students' perceptions of this teacher's self-branding? Especially, do the students consider too much self-branding may affect the genuineness of the teachers?
That's a really, really good question, Stephanie. There, as of yet, has been relatively little research conducted about how students actually select teachers. Part of the reason is because I think that it's if you talk to students, they have a hard time describing how they select teachers. I think that would be a really important area, by the way, for future research, and really, really interesting to look at. To actually maybe even do some research, basically just peering over the shoulder of students as they go about selecting teachers. Students often mention essentially something about vibes. They want a teacher. Oh, I want a teacher I like. I just like this teacher. They seem cool. Also, oftentimes they want something they feel they can talk to, i.e. they have things in common. And this might explain why hobbies are very, very frequently included in the bios of teachers. Teachers oftentimes write all their hobbies. I think part of the reason they're trying to hopefully get some congruence with the hobbies of the students, because this is something students seem to very much value. I would also say, I think, again, based on what students have said, I think they value things like physical appearance. I think it is something that sort of, although it's a little harder to get a handle on, because people, if you interview them, are not very likely to say, oh, I just picked the prettiest teacher. Right? Yeah. It's probably not something to admit. If they're easy, yeah. Yeah.
So earlier you mentioned neoliberalism and also the platforms are exploratory, because that's also a lot of scholars in platform studies talk about the exploratory nature of the platforms. And which was also mentioned at all, exploiting the tutors' labor. I wonder if you could elaborate more on that, the exploitative nature of online teaching because, yeah, again, because of my own research on online translation, they're all freelancers or on online platforms or any platforms or intermediary platforms like Facebook, Twitter, WeChat, any of those platforms, they exploit volunteers labor to translate for them. And then that generate data, which only the platforms benefits, right? They gains from that. So I would really talk about this.
Yeah, I mean, I think we could make the argument that platforms are almost inherently exploitative in the sense that they rely so much on unpaid labor of all their workers, or sorry, of all their users, right? So we are all laborers in that sense, and we use things like Facebook or Netflix, right? In terms of online tutoring platforms, right, where people are explicitly working and getting money, I mean, I think there's a wide variety of kind of I think there are some platforms that are much more exploitative than others. So I think there are platforms where, for example, you know, especially they might have teachers who frankly really need the money, especially maybe if they're from areas like Global South where there are very few other available sources of well-paid employment. And from what I can tell, those oftentimes are the platforms that are engaging in things that are more explicitly illegal, essentially. They're doing things like wage garnishing, right? In the work that Joy and I did, she interviewed these teachers, and a lot of them were talking about things like, you know, they would if they maybe they had a power outage and they were late for a lesson, they wouldn't just lose, you know, say that lesson's fee, they would have money taken out from the previous lessons and things like that. There's also, you know, stories of this, you know, not stories. There's also these very harrowing accounts from teachers talking about the sexual harassment they've experienced and things like this. I mean, I think that I'm not anti-platform because again, I think it's actually in some ways I think the platforms are better than, for instance, things like private tutoring companies. I think a lot of private tutoring companies, for example, would only hire teachers who are native speakers. They wouldn't hire them. So this gives a chance, for instance, for non-native speakers, right, to have a chance to teach English. And again, many times these are excellent, amazing teachers, right? So gives them a chance to work. So I think that's good. But I do think there are some platforms that are worse than others. And in terms of your question, I mean, exploitative platforms, I guess they're all right. The platform model almost seems like inherently exploitative, right?
Yeah, I know. Yeah. So it's actually the platformization is fairly new in practical studies as well. The phenomenon has been penetrating for a long time. So it's really, really interesting and widely applicable to a wide variety of places. You know.
And your book chapter, I think, does a very excellent job of highlighting a lot of these issues.
Yeah, thanks.
I would just say, maybe if I could just address what I think. I think, yeah, the examples I gave are mostly, not all, but mostly female tutors, but there are quite a few male tutors as well. I mean, 10 to 20%, at least are male.
So we got something about the affects. I was going to mention that as well. Yeah, as the self-branding, perhaps the teaching modes based on students personalized demands. Yeah, and emotional. It must be emotionally demanding as well. I guess I don't know. I've never taught online.
I think a lot of tutors talk about how emotionally demanding it is, and a lot of them have said that they're not teachers. You know, I'm not just a teacher. I'm also, you know, I'm also a shrink. I'm also a counselor. I'm also, you know, a friend. Yeah, and I think we do see a lot of teachers or students who are looking for personalized sort of teachers. What's interesting though is you see different teachers take different self-branding strategies. So in answer to your question, Chairman, so you'll see some teachers who seem to want to appeal to everybody. That's kind of their branding strategy. But there's other teachers who you can see very much talk about, and you can see this reflected in their branding as well. They try to appeal to a niche market. You know, and you see this both on online tutoring programs and also in the context of billions. Is that right, Steffi? Yeah. So you see kind of these two different approaches, and a lot of teachers certainly are sort of seeking out a specific kind of student.
Yeah, one more. I think it's great to mention neoliberalism and critical paradigm. But I just, one thing came to my mind. If we look at language teaching here from a critical paradigm, let's look on the bright side. You said teachers are trying to entertain those students, but does that mean teacher-student relationship actually can be transformed? I remember the book written by the Brazilian author Freire. Yeah. Yeah, so we have this one-on-one teaching, and teachers actually, some teachers may not need to entertain the students, they just build rapport with the students, right? Because, you just match your style with the students.
Yeah.
And then actually we have a more balanced, more, we can achieve more equity in building this teacher-student relationship. So is this also critical, paradigm? I'm just thinking about this question. So is it a bad thing that teachers try to please students? Maybe it's also good.
I see where you're coming from. I think the short answer would be though, I think in the context of a traditional classroom, teachers have a lot more power than students. But in the context of online tutoring platforms, students have all the power. Teachers essentially have no power.
I guess that goes down to the background that it's gig economy. It's not institutional teaching. So the whole setting, the whole discourse is different from.
And there's nothing that teachers can offer in the context of me as a university instructor. I give a grade to the student. The student knows that. In terms of online teaching platform, you could imagine some students want the teacher to like them, but there's nothing really concrete the teacher can offer. So but at the same time they can just be fired instantaneously. So the power dynamic is very, very different.
Interesting.
And quite problematic, I think, in the context of online tutoring. So I think do we all try to entertain our students? Yeah, we do. But partly it's because we want them to like us. Right? It's not that we're afraid we're suddenly be fired, right?
We also face pressure, teacher accountability.
Similarities but also differences. Yeah, especially and also the platforms for affordances. That's another interesting area, and also I was wondering the interaction between, because both students and online tutors, they are users of the platforms. But then how about this triangle dynamic? The student interacts with the platform as well as how the tutors interact with the platform. It very much depends on the affordances, the infrastructure of the platform.
Yeah, I think it contributes very much to how how students view the teachers. For example, I think the model of having a single lesson, I think is probably somewhat problematic. It sets up a very specific type of power dynamic. I think you could imagine a platform that for instance, you could imagine a platform that before every lesson it makes students watch a 30-second video that tells them be respectful to the teachers and warns them, and threatens them with, expulsion if they behave badly. Even something like that, I think would be an important thing to include, right? But of course, the platforms are essentially these platforms, right? They're very lean platforms, and they're not. I don't think many of them are willing to put a lot of work. Right? They're kind of taking a very easy road, right? Acting as an intermediary. I also would just like to say I saw something that Carlos said, and I would say, yeah, I think certainly in online tutoring platforms and other content as well, non-native speakers tend to be much better instructors. It's not to say that there's something inherently wrong with native speakers. I think they can be great teachers too. But by and large, in general, non-native speakers are going to be superior, I think, instructors of the language most times, especially if you look at the teachers who are on online tutoring platforms. I think, I also like to say, if Professor Jenks wants to share something, he's a very senior scholar working on these issues. So I'd be very curious to hear his opinion or his 2 cents.
I think you've said everything that we need to hear, Ming.
That means I think that we're supposed to bring things to a close. I think is what Professor Jenks means.
Yeah, thank you so much, Professor Jenks, for drawing that to our attention. And we had very fruitful discussions as well. Thank you very much again, Ming, for a wonderful talk and for sharing your research with us. Thank you very much for joining us from around the world, and also colleagues here in the room, we will upload the recording upon the consent of the speaker.
Can you use some sort of Photoshop or something?
We will filter it,
Yeah.
make it more attractive.
Okay. And I would just like to thank everyone for who's online for coming, and please feel free to email me any questions or just introduce yourself. If you've asked a question, and thank you so much for coming.
Yeah, and lastly, to promote our center, we organize seminars regularly on the topic of transition, interpreting, and intercultural studies. So please stay tuned. We look forward to seeing you next time. So bye, everyone.